Okay, so it is now March 30th, release cut day, and actually I just gave the go signal officially like 2 hours ago, but let's walk through everything that happened since my last video, especially the go no-go decision. So here is our thread from before, and I'm opening it over here, make it a little bit bigger. Scroll to the top. Basically each day you can see that I gave a update, and we'll walk through this in some more detail, but in general, basically I would do the normal responsibilities of checking test grid, creating any issues if there's any failures, or following up on outstanding issues, and then report here if there was a risk once per day to the release cut. And I'm recording this during the release cut for 124's code freeze. So there were a lot of things that popped up, but also a lot of folks actively fixing issues, sometimes even before I could catch them. So we'll see some of that as I walk through. Starting now. So basically where we left off before is this first message, right? These first three messages, especially this one. And this was fixed pretty much right after I recorded this video, this one master blocking failure. You can see some of the evidence of that here. And then the next update, scrolling down here, that I gave was 3 days before release cut. And since the prior risk was fixed and there were no new failing tests, there were no direct blockers to the go signal, which I mentioned here. But there was a long-standing flake that we had open for a long time. And I wanted to confirm that this was not a release blocker, even though that was my assumption. So I asked the SIG that owns the flaky test SIG network whether this was going to be a release blocker or not in their opinion. So we can click through both on the thread here. You can see that I asked if this should be considered release blocking now that the release is moving into beta. You can see the answer was no. And the same thing, let me get back to it here, on the issue. You can see that I cross-posted from Slack boosting this because we're doing the beta release, and should this be considered release blocking? And you can see that there are some comments, and again, cross-confirmed that this is not a release blocker. So that was useful to me to know that it, even though this was still an open flake, it wasn't a release blocker. So the next day, when I gave my daily update, I checked all the boards. Since the only open flake at the time had already been identified as not a release blocker, I concluded that there were no risks and just updated everybody in this thread. And then before I go to the next part, I'll just mention that between this update and the next update, there was actually a widespread test outage, which was actually discussed over in the release CI signal channel. So let me minimize this thread for a little bit so you can see here. So this one, widespread failures, blah, 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 blah. So click on that. This I just noticed during my regular rounds. However, it did get resolved within a few hours, so it didn't actually impact the report that I made to release management. Again, back over to our regular reporting thread. By the time I give my report for the one-day update, those failures had been resolved. But later that day, there was a new failure in master blocking. So the usual activity, I created a new issue. And if we actually click through this to see this issue, you can see it has a normal format, but in the comments here, you'll see that I cross-referenced a bunch of stuff to Slack and to other issues and PRs because it's actively under investigation at the time that I noticed it. But your role as CI Signal is to elevate any failures that are direct blockers to the release cut, give a sense to the people who are working on it how soon that release cut is, and therefore when you need the resolution to be done by so people can prioritize it correctly. So I opened this issue and started commenting everywhere that people were already working on this to elevate the fact that this was a risk for the release cut on the 30th. And just to walk through this a little bit, I noticed that it was being talked about on some Slack threads, that it had been associated with a test that had been merged pretty recently, that there was a issue and a PR in progress at the time. Neither of these were closed. They were open because SIG API Machinery was working on it at that time, and that this was also being discussed in SIG API Machinery Slack. So between these two, I picked one where that was the most active. And just to click in here and scroll way up, you'll see that I mentioned that this is a risk for blocking the beta release cut tomorrow, asked if it will be resolved by tomorrow's release cut, and in particular, I decided this was the canonical place or person to ping, and that I would be keeping an eye on everything, but to ping this person who was assigned to the issue, CC everybody that I know, basically. And basically, you can see that I'm trying to optimize who to contact and tell them the important part for our role on CI Signal, that this needs to be resolved by release cut, because I can't give a go signal unless this is determined to not be a release blocker or is resolved in time. So back to the mainline reporting thread over here. This easy way. So again, here, this is where I give the daily updates, right? This is the reporting thread and release management. So this is tied to here. This is where I say that we do have a risk. It's this failing test. And as we just saw, there's a bunch of stuff going on in the background in terms of contacting people on Slack and contacting people on this issue. But this is where I highlight that as a risk. And I do so in this daily update. And then right before I signed off for this day, the owner of the fix, so let's go back over to this, open up this in a second. The owner of this fix stated that it was no longer release blocking in one of the Slack threads. So I commented that here, that this should now be resolved and not be a blocker. But from my perspective, test grid was still red, but we expected it to clear up once things had started running for a while. So I'm leaving this open for now, but expecting it not to block the release cut tomorrow. And since I, added this comment, then a lot of people had the context. Things that affected this could close this issue, and then in the end, somebody who had all the context because of all this communication could also comment on this thread while I was offline, so people knew what was going on. So that was good. And then finally, morning of, the release cut was being cut on Pacific time, so the signal needed to be provided by 9 a.m. PT. So now that this risk had been resolved the night before, and that I rechecked all of the boards and there were no new failures, I totally finalized that the CI signal was sending the go signal, and I CC'd again all my buddies on the release branch management team and on CI signal, so everybody knows. And that's it. That's a little deep dive into what the expectations are and what you'll probably be doing during the decision to give a go, no-go signal for a release cut.